Hello there friends, welcome to another video on social science research methodologies. In this demo, I will explain to you the qualitative research approaches. I recommend that as a prerequisite for this demo, please watch my video on quantitative versus qualitative research, where I have explained the foundational and the very conceptual differences between the two research methodologies. In this demo, I specifically would like to introduce you to these certain approaches in qualitative research, how data collection is done in a qualitative research, how data analysis is done in qualitative research, what are the pros and cons of qualitative research, and lastly, I'll present some sample research questions that are feasible in the qualitative research. So please follow this video until the end because there are some helpful information that you may need. By now, you know that qualitative research involves collecting and analyzing non-quantitative or non-numerical data, such as text, journals, interviews, etc. And it's pretty much the opposite of quantitative research, in which the catalyst for our research is collection and analysis of numerical data through statistical and data analysis. So qualitative research is commonly used in subjects of humanity such as sociology, anthropology, education, history, etc. These subjects, these disciplines have a non-scientific nature to them. So qualitative research is, although it is a major research methodology in social science and also non-social science research practices, it also has a less applicability in a scientific academic realm. It has more applicability with humanities subjects. And some of the common approaches that are used in qualitative research are ethnography, grounded theory, phenomenological research, and action research. And again, these are just some of the common approaches that I collected to explain in this demo. Through ethnography, a researcher is able to participate in groups or collections to understand the culture or way of living of that group. So, for instance, to understand how a community or a group of or a collective of people act or behave a certain way, then a researcher participates in an ethnographic research or in an ethnography where the researcher has the opportunity to understand, to study, explore, and understand the culture or that subject of study through observations and through the lenses of the practices that happen and also in the context of where it's happening. Um, the second one is grounded theory. Through a grounded theory, a researcher is able to collect data and information and develop theories in an inductive manner. In other words, a researcher studies and observe ways of the ways that things happen in a research context, but then uses those samples or uses those observations to develop a theory that has inductive nature to it. The third one is the phenomenological research. Through a phenomenological research, a researcher is able to study a phenomenon or an event by exploring and studying the subjects who have lived, who have been through that phenomenon. Or, in other words, a researcher is through phenomenological research, a researcher is able to study that phenomenon through the lenses of the person who has actually experienced that phenomenon in their daily life. The fourth one is the action research, and through the action research, a researcher is able to work cooperatively to link the practice, to link the theory to the actual practice while looking while actively researching that specific subject. Through an action research, a researcher is able to work with the subjects or with the participants of the study in a collaborative manner to connect the theory to the actual practices. So, for example, a classroom theory where both a teacher and students, the teacher being the researcher and students being the participants, work collaboratively to, to link theories to the actual practical or practices is a good example of what an action research is. So, how are data collected in qualitative research? Um, Mostly, these are some of the common methods that I've listed here. Interviews is one of the common ways that data could be collected, where a researcher can personally ask the subjects of the study questions in a one-on-one conversation. Focus groups is also another way, a method of collecting data, where a researcher can ask questions among a specific group of people. So, for instance, if a researcher is studying how, for example, basketball players, do something a certain way, or studying a phenomenon related to basketball sports, and the focus groups will be basketball players. Or, for example, if a researcher is studying a subject related to pharmaceutical discourses. The other one is observations, and observations allows the researcher to be able to see, observe, even record in very detailed notes. It's his or her observations. The other one is surveys, and through surveys, the researcher is able to um, collect information through questionnaires. And questionnaires may have different formats, including open-ended questions, or yes or no question, multiple choice questions. And you can review my video on survey and sampling method, where I've provided detailed explanation of what surveys are and how they're done in a social science research practice. And then the last one is secondary research, where a researcher is able to collect any existing data that have been already collected. So the researcher is able to actually review and analyze those secondary research data towards building the conclusion, analysis and conclusion of its study. What are the data analysis methods in qualitative research? I will have a separate video on what each of these analysis types are. But for right now, I will just provide basic information of what they are. The thematic analysis is simply when a researcher or when an analyst explores and identify themes and patterns in qualitative data. So remember that one of the major responsibilities of a data analyst or researcher is to actually decode or detect those themes that are hidden in a subject that's being studied. So a thematic analysis is when the analyst is using certain or applying certain techniques and methodologies to actually be able to identify and explore those thematic patterns in the case study. The second one is the textual analysis, and as the name implies, it's when the researcher studies the content or the text of a subject. So, an example could be when a researcher reviews, for example, a journal or news or articles from a specific time to actually to enable him or her to study and draw conclusions about the subject. The other one is discourse analysis. And in discourse analysis, the researcher actually studies and explores the discourse, the communication about how the effects have been achieved in that particular context. So, for example, if we are looking at an economic discourse related to how something developed economically, then we will need to do a discourse analysis to look at that particular discourse that involved development of that particular subject or that particular case study. So the discourse analysis again kind of narrows down your research analysis into the context where a discourse are taking place. Last one is the content analysis, which is when a researcher or an analyst actually explores the common phrases and terminologies and language that are used in a qualitative data subject in order to be able to describe the ideas and the sentiments that are embedded within that subject. So, for instance, an analyst can perform content analysis to see what the customers think or feel about a business of XYZ by looking at the content of reviews and comments that the customers have published for that business. So the content analysis kind of disregards all these extra information that are that exists in a subject data, and instead it looks at specific phrases, terminologies, and words that actually communicate an idea to establish whether, for example, a business is doing well or a business is doing poor. And before I complete my discussion of data analysis methods, as I said, I'll have additional videos where I'll break down, I'll provide detailed breakdown of these analyses, which are very important because not only these analyses could be done through manual and qualitative based approach and practices. Some of these analyses can also be done through tools and softwares that really facilitates the job for a data analyst. And then pros and cons of qualitative research. There are the pros of qualitative research is that it's flexible. It gives a researcher the flexibility, so the researcher is able to decide beforehand what that researcher would like to do in terms of the ideas and where the research is going to lead to. It provides more flexibility than when you're dealing with quantitative based research. Meaningful insights. Remember that data is not always the ultimate or final solution to a topic or research question, although they could be very helpful in introducing insights, or in other words, and decoding insight into something that we don't know, but it's not a complete approach. So qualitative research can sometimes fill in those gaps that quantitative research leaves. And so meaningful insight here means that a lot of detailed descriptions of experience and feelings and perceptions, they may be missed by a quantitative based research. And so qualitative research can actually achieve those insights. And generation of new ideas, of course, this is as you work with people, as you work closely with people, make observation and put yourself in the position of your subjects and the participants. Actually, you are allowed the opportunity to not only understand and build understanding of that phenomenon, but you can also develop new ideas related to the subject. So, and the last one is natural settings. So I believe that in qualitative research, a researcher is in its natural setting, meaning that the researcher is dealing with a research phenomenon, research subject in real world context. or in a very naturalistic ways rather than just looking at numbers or performing number crunching in order to produce a conclusion about a research. And there are some cons as well. One of the most significant cons of a qualitative research is that it puts the research at more risk of bias than quantitative research, and that's because the researcher is actually the one deciding on the conclusion of the study, or pretty much the researcher has the authority over the study from the start until the end of the study. Therefore, this dependence on the researcher actually puts the approach at more risk of bias than when it's done quantitatively. And the next one is subjectivity, which is that and the research analysis is subjective, and it's dependent again. It's dependent on the interpretation of the researcher, and both subjectivity and unreliability, and even limited generalizability. These three cons actually break the conditions of of a scientific research. In order for a research to be scientific, or in order for research to be generalizable, then those that research has to be objective and reliable. And so, pretty much, when we are saying that one of the cons of the qualitative research is that it's subjective, then we are moving away from scientific or objective research practices more toward the spectrum where everything is dependent on the researcher and the researcher's decision and authority over the study. So, and the unreliability is just like subjectivity affects the validity of the research, because the researcher can often have no control over factors that may affect the data. So, and again, we're not dealing with quantitative or with standard data that could be replicated by a different researcher or analyst. It's just the data is just a product of a researcher's analysis. Therefore, it affects the reliability of the research. And the next one is limited generalizability. That although there are a complex set of procedures for analysis, even in the qualitative research practices, it's often
which is
difficult to draw generalizable conclusion because the data may be small, the data samples may be small, may be biased, or may not be representative of the wider population. So, for example, if you're doing interview with if a researcher is performing interview with, let's say, one or two participants, then those two interviews cannot be generalizable to the overall population because two people cannot be representative of the wider population. And the last one is the extensive resources, and that's the fact that researchers and analysts will have to invest and spend a lot of resources in order to, let's say, travel to the sites, to perform field trips, to perform ethnographies, to perform interviews. So all of that can take a significant amount of resources from the researcher or analyst. And lastly, I listed a few examples of what qualitative research questions could look like. The first one is, what causes a particular ethnic community to have more civic engagement than other ethnic communities? The other one is, how do successful parents raise successful children? Third one is, why do urban population have better technological education than rural population? The other one is, why do certain rural communities prosper economically as opposed to urban communities? And lastly, how is stress dealt with in poor communities? All of these research questions require that the researcher or analyst actually participate in qualitative research practices in order to be able to study and explore concepts, opinions, or experiences, or gather in depth insights into these questions. That was it for this video. Thank you for your time.